Okay folks, welcome to part 4 of the How to Play Basic Impetus. In this one I want to get a little bit more into the rules themselves, in particular regarding movement. I'm going to try and cover the basic ways you move your units, as well as wheeling and shifting sideways and obliques and rear movements, and get into a little bit of the charging mechanics, basically moving into contact, how and when, if you will. So I hope you are inspired by this, maybe even learn something about basic impetus. Okay, let's get right into it, and I hope you enjoy, folks. At this point, we're going to talk about movement and get into the details of how it works and how to carry it out and the different ways you can move a unit or group of units. But from the get-go, it's important to note that during this period of history, ancient, medieval, and early Renaissance, it was fairly difficult getting troops to move properly and maintain any kind of order in their lines. And this is reflected quite well in the rules of basic impetus and full impetus as well. You'll find that straightforward movement of your forces is the easiest and best way to go. But there is options of wheeling, turning, shifting, moving backwards, but they usually come at a heavy cost in this game, usually in the form of disorder. So it's not a quick process maneuvering your forces into battle. So deployment is key in ancient and medieval battle, so pay attention to that. Okay, let's go into the basics of movement. Now, in basic impetus, it's important to note on your army list the movement statistic for the unit you're in question. That tells you the number of units the unit will move. Now, in my case, I use 15mm scale figures in armies for my games. So that means one unit converts to 1 centimeter. So I'll use that in all my examples. As we go to movement, the basic movement is straightforward. It's easy, there's no penalties to it, unless of course you move through other troops or difficult terrain. It's pretty much just your basic form of movement, and the most common. Now, for instance, let's take this unit of heavy foot. They have a movement stat of 5, which equals 5 centimeters in my scale game. So if I want to move them straight forward, I just measure off 5 centimeters, and there they are. There's its move. It's done. Now next to them, I have a group of foot troops, including some skirmishers and 2 units of heavy foot. I want to move them as a group straight forward as well. Now in their case, the skirmishers move 8 units. The heavy foot move 5, like this guy. So in order to maintain that group move, the whole thing would move 5, which is the rate of the slowest unit. I'm going to do that. So again, there we go. 5 units forward, 5 centimeters. Now over here, I have a third group I want to move forward, preferably as a group. It's 3 units. They are in formation for a group. However, this unit is disordered, which, if you remember, means it is no longer part of any group. So I can't move him forward with these guys. But these guys I will move forward. They are a legal group. And in this case, this unit moves 5, this unit moves 7. I'm going to move 5 so I can keep them together. Straightforward move. And of course, this unit decides not to move at all. And over here I have a final group of skirmishers with cav. And again, they're going to move their rate. Now they both move 8 units, which is 8 centimeters. So I'll move them forward their full distance of 8. So there they are. That is the basic way movement works in impetus. Straightforward movement. Now another option for units moving is what's known as the wheel. It's basically turning, changing your facing, and you're basically turning and pivoting on a front corner of the unit or the group of units. Again, it can be done by units individually. It could also be done by groups, and you can be disordered and still carry it out. Let's show you how that's done in an actual game. There we have one unit, all by its lonesome, and he wants to make a turn in that direction. Well, I have a little base here that I keep spare just for this purpose, and I use this to actually measure my wheels. Some people like to use templates and things, and that's fine. I like to use my little base. It's the same frontage as the unit, so it fits perfectly. And what I do is I place that on one corner, the corner that I'm turning, and I measure the distance. In this case, their movement is 5 centimeters, or 5 units. So I will measure that, and boom, there it is. Once I have it, I just shuffle this guy forward, right in place, and that's his 5 centimeter wheel. Easy and simple. Over here, we have a group of units. Now, they want to do the same thing. Basically, some people like to use long rods and such to do the same thing that I did with the base. My base is only for individual units, so it's not good in this situation. So what I do similar. I take the tape measure and I line it up just right and put my thumb on the opposite corner so I know where the corner is, and I just pivot it. Measure it the same degree, and in this case there's the 5 centimeters, and I just shuffle the guys in place. So that is a group wheel. Nice. Now, one option that exists for units that are wheeling is, as long as they do not start disordered, in other words, they're not disordered, they have the option of not only wheeling, but moving straight forward afterwards, which the end result of is they are disordered. Now, it's an option available only to units that are not disordered. They carry out their wheel, and they follow it with a forward movement. In other words, the rest of their movement, whatever's left. Now, let's take an example. Now, here we got a unit. It's not disordered, so it does have that option. Now, it's going to wheel. Its movement is 5. Now, its wheel is only going to be 2 centimeters, or 2 units of movement, and that would be right there, because it wants to move forward after this. So it moves 2 of its 5 units forward, and it has 3 left. Now, by doing this, this will disorder the unit at the end of its forward movement. So that's how that would be carried out, and the unit would be marked as disordered. One more thing to keep in mind when wheeling units or groups is that artillery, the maximum wheel they can make is 45 degrees, so their facing change cannot be greater than that. For other units, cavalry, infantry, and so on, the max is 90 degrees. So keep those in mind when you make your wheels. Now, besides the normal straightforward movements and wheels that units and groups can move, there's also 3 other special maneuvers that units can take. One is oblique, where they move forward at an angle. The second one is a sideways move, or a shift to the left or right. And the final one is a move directly to a unit's rear. Now, there's 5 things we need to keep in mind if we carry out any of these 3 special maneuvers. All right, first of all, they can only be carried out by individual units. That is, groups can't make an oblique or sideways or rear move, only individual units. Secondly, the unit using one of these 3 maneuvers can't be disordered. Now, the exception to this is skirmishers and light cavalry. They can be disordered and make a move to the rear. Now, that's the only exception. They couldn't make an oblique or sideways if they're disordered, but if their movement is to the rear, they can make one of these movements. They can be disordered. Okay, thirdly, any unit that does any of these moves is automatically disordered. And there is another exception to this. Again, light cavalry and skirmishers are not disordered if they make any of these moves, whether it's oblique, sideways, or to the rear. Fourthly, no contact can be made with enemy units using an oblique, sideways, or rear move. So we need to remember that. And finally, number 5 is that a unit that makes one of these moves maintains its current facing. There's no facing changes here. So let's run through some examples and see how we carry these things out. Now, none of these units are disordered. This unit here of heavy foot, he would like to move at an oblique, and I want him up in this position. I could use one of these bases, or I could just measure the angle like this from one of the corners. I'm going to use the base. I want him in this position. I would measure out his movement distance of 5 centimeters in this case, and make sure to maintain that same facing he already has. That would take him here. So I just shift him up ahead, and there he is. And then he's marked as disordered. Next unit of heavy foot, now he wants to do a shift this direction. He wants to move to the left, sideways. He's not disordered, he can do it. Now again, I could use this little base and just lay it down and measure the distance that way, or I could just move him the distance, in this case 5 centimeters, which I do. That would take him there, and he'd be marked as disordered. Now, I got some skirmishers up ahead, and they're having a bad day, so I'm kind of thinking I want to pull them back with a move to the rear. Now, if you remember, skirmishers do not gain disorder if they carry out any of the moves, oblique, sideways, or rear. In addition, a unit of skirmishers, or light cav, that is disordered can still move straight back. So that is an option for him. He can't oblique and he can't move sideways, but this unit, although he's disordered, can move straight back, which is what I would like to do. And he can move 8, so I move him the full 8, straight back. And remember, he does not gain any disorder anyway for doing that move. This unit isn't disordered anyway. He wants to also move back. And I could use this little base too for the same purpose, to measure the position, which I can do, and that would take him to about here. Again, he moves about 8 centimeters, but I'm going to be happy with that distance. And he does not gain any disorder for that move as well. So those are your 3 special moves and some things to keep in mind regarding them. At this point, I'd like to cover moving into contact with the enemy, otherwise known as charging. Basically, what is it? It is, at its basis, a straightforward, straight line movement into contact with the enemy. You don't have to line up in any particular way. You just have to make contact with the enemy. And it's always a straightforward move. So therefore, you can't make contact with the enemy if it's an oblique or a sideways or a rear move. It's a straightforward move. The exception to this would be a wheel. You are allowed, if you're not disordered, to make a wheel before that straight line movement into contact. But the end result of that would be that you are disordered. So you'd be getting into combat disordered if you do that. But it can be worthwhile, depends on the circumstance. So let's see how this works on the table. Okay, up ahead, I have a unit of heavy foot here. The normal movement is 5. And if I measure that straight ahead, that will bring me into contact with the enemy. Simple move. I just measure it and move it straight ahead. He is now in contact with these 2 enemy units. Now, in the case of this unit over here, again, it's 5. Now, the distance away, and again, there's pre-measuring in basic impetus, so you can do this. The distance here is 7 centimeters, which is beyond my normal 5 centimeters distance. So what we have in this case is what is called a charge bonus. That's what the rules call them. And it's basically an extra D6 roll of movement added to your normal movement. For foot troops, it would be a D6 halved rounded up. So basically you get an extra 1 to 3 centimeters added to your base move, your charge. For cavalry, it would be whatever you roll. That would be the bonus in centimeters, which would be 1 to 6. So in this case, being 7 centimeters away, I would probably take that charge bonus and hope that I get a 2 or greater, because my normal move is 5 and they're 7 away. So if I reach them with that bonus, I make contact and we fight combat as normal. However, if I roll it and add it to my normal and I still come up short, like say for instance I roll a 1 and it took me to that position, I failed to make contact. The result of that, because I used the charge bonus, is that I become disordered. So that's the downside of making the charge. But if you do make contact, you're not disordered, you make contact, you fight, there you go. So there's the charge bonus. Now over here, we have a similar situation. I got my heavy foot. I want to make contact with those skirmishers. They're less than 4 centimeters away. I'll make a straight line movement, straight ahead. I made contact at the corner there. There, I'm in contact, we fight the melee. Very simple. Now down here we have an interesting situation. I've got some skirmishers, and they don't really want to make contact with these knights. However, to point something out here is that in order to be able to make contact with the enemy during your movement, i.e. charge, you have to have an impetus bonus, and that's on your stat sheet for your army list, of at least 1. Now, in the case of these skirmishers, their impetus bonus is 0, which means they cannot take a move into contact with the enemy. So these guys could not move into contact with the enemy. And over here, one last example. I have a unit of knights who wants to make contact with this disordered unit of knights. Now, if I wanted to make contact by wheeling, again, if you remember how the wheeling works, I would just place this down. I'm not disordered, so I can do this. I measure my wheel distance, and I make the wheel. Let's say that was 2 centimeters. At that point, I have normally 8 centimeters of movement, minus the 2 for wheeling, so I'm at 6. The distance away is a little less than 5, so that would take me into contact there. And that was a straight line movement following the wheel. That initiates contact. That is an allowable contact. And I should point out one last thing before I go, that after this wheel, this unit became disordered. So we have to remember that if you wheel before you move into contact, you become disordered. So it does have its negative benefits, but there are instances in the game where a wheel is beneficial before contact. And we'll get into that when we get into the close combat section. Okay, folks, so that is your moving into contact. I think I should point out when we're talking about moving into contact and charging and so on, is that, yes, you can do this as groups as well. I could move my group of knights, 3 separate units, as a whole, and actually make contact with some of them against these enemy units. You can do that. But as you'll see later on when we talk about melee and combat resolution, as soon as a unit is done moving, you immediately resolve its melee. It's like it's part of the same activation. So the question comes, how do you do that when you're moving a group of units? The simple answer is you basically continue moving all the units in the group until they either make contact with the enemy or they've reached the maximum distance they can move in the turn. Once that's all complete for the group, you resolve all the melees in one go. So in this example here, they move 8 centimeters or 8 units. And as a group, they would be moving all at once. This unit would move to there, and it has movement to spare, so it would stop. The second unit would also have some extra movement left over when it makes contact, and it would stop there. And finally, this unit wouldn't make contact with anyone, and would probably end right about there. And then I would resolve the melees for these 2 units, who are fighting these 2 units, because they're in contact. So yes, you can do this as a group move as well, and you can see right away in the next turn or the next activation, this is no longer a valid group. Even if these were removed in combat, there would be no more frontal alignment, so to say. So that's the risk you take, but there you go, folks. You can do it as a group. Okay, folks, that pretty much brings part 4 to a close. Still quite a bit to cover regarding movement. In part 5, I'll go into more details about interpenetration, some of the other types of movement, such as pursuit moves and retreats. They relate more to close combat, but I'll see if I can touch on them as well. Again, I hope you learned something from this, and I hope you got inspired to get more into Basic Impetus. And again, check the description. There's a link there that takes you to the Basic Impetus Rules. They are free, and a full ton of army lists are available. Okay, folks, again, I hope you enjoy. And stay tuned. Part 5 coming soon.